The cold wind whipped across the vast Montana plains, carrying with it the scent of pine and the faint tang of the river that ran along the northern edge of the ranch. The sun had begun its slow descent behind jagged, snow-capped ridges, casting long, eerie shadows across the rolling fields. Luke Harlan, a seasoned rancher with sun-baked skin and hands rough as rope, squinted against the fading light. He had been checking on the herd all afternoon, ensuring the cattle were fed and the fences held against the creeping snow. It had been a long day, and his bones ached, but he took pride in knowing every inch of his land. As he trudged back toward the barn, his boots crunching over frozen grass and frost-hardened dirt, something caught his eye. One of his mares, Daisy, the chestnut beauty who had been with him through thick and thin, wasn't standing with the others. Instead, she was pacing near the barn, her flanks heaving, eyes wide and frantic. Her breath came out in thick white clouds that vanished into the cold evening air. Luke frowned, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. "Daisy, what's wrong, girl?" he called softly, his voice carrying across the still fields. Daisy's pacing became more erratic, her hooves scraping against the ground with an urgency that made Luke's stomach knot. He approached cautiously, lantern in hand, the small flame flickering against the growing darkness. The closer he got, the more he noticed it, her leg. One of her hind legs was grotesquely swollen, the skin taut and shiny as though ready to split. It was more than a simple injury, it was alarming. Luke froze, the lantern light trembling in his hand as he studied the mare. He ran a calloused hand along her side, feeling her tremble beneath his touch. "Easy, girl, easy," he murmured, trying to calm both her and himself. The swelling pulsed beneath his palm, warm and frighteningly alive. Luke's jaw tightened. He'd seen injuries before, broken limbs, sprains, and the occasional illness that could take a horse overnight, but nothing like this. Nothing that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He backed up a step and glanced around the barnyard, the skeletal remains of the old corral creaking in the wind. The nearest vet lived over 30 miles away, and the storm that had been creeping over the mountains all afternoon was now moving fast, promising to trap him and his animals in ice and snow. Luke swallowed hard. "Great, just great," he muttered. The cold bit at his face, but it couldn't compare to the gnawing fear inside him. Daisy whinnied sharply, a sound that cut through the stillness like a knife. Her hooves pawed at the ground, scattering frost and straw. Luke knelt beside her, inspecting the leg more closely. The swelling seemed unnatural, almost exaggerated, as if it had been magnified by some unseen force. His mind raced through every possibility: infection, snakebite, insect, frostbite, nothing seemed to fit. And then he felt it. A subtle movement under the skin, a faint pulse that made his stomach churn. Luke's breath caught. He stared, hand frozen midair. His mind screamed at him to stay calm, to think clearly, but fear made it impossible. Daisy's eyes, normally gentle and trusting, now reflected pure panic. The mare shifted her weight, trying to lift the swollen leg, but the effort made her whinny again. Luke steadied himself, gripping the lantern tightly, the small flame trembling with the motion of his hands. He needed to act, but every logical thought clashed with the instinctual fear rising in his chest. He muttered under his breath, "I can't lose you, girl, not you." Luke had raised Daisy since she was a foal. She'd carried him across rugged plains, through blazing summers and bitter winters. She was more than just a horse, she was family. And now, faced with the unexplainable swelling, he felt a surge of desperation unlike anything he'd known. Luke scanned the barnyard again, eyes narrowing. The wind rattled the old boards of the barn, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote howled. He gritted his teeth, fighting down the adrenaline. His hand hovered over his medical kit, worn and dented from years of ranch work. He wasn't a doctor, but he had patched up enough animals in his time to know that hesitation could mean death. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage, Luke knelt beside Daisy again, placing a firm hand on her leg. The pulsating under her skin sent a shiver through him. "Whatever's in there, we're getting it out," he whispered, jaw tight, heart hammering in his chest. The wind blew harder, rattling the lantern and throwing shadows across the barn, making the swelling look even more grotesque. Luke's stomach turned at the thought of what might be hiding beneath her skin. Daisy shivered violently, pressing close to him as if sensing his fear. Luke took a deep breath, steadying his shaking hands. One thing was certain: whatever had done this, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't waiting for the vet. It was up to him. And Luke Harlan, rancher and survivor of 1,000 unforgiving Montana winters, wasn't about to let the mare he loved die on his watch. Luke's hands shook as he poured a measure of whiskey over his knife, the sharp aroma cutting through the bitter cold and mingling with the scent of hay and horse sweat. He had patched up broken legs, deep cuts, and even the occasional snakebite, but this was something else entirely. The swelling in Daisy's leg wasn't just unnatural, it was alive. Something pulsed beneath the surface, writhing just out of sight, and Luke felt his stomach twist in both fear and determination. He swallowed hard and muttered, "Gotta do it, it's the only way." He knelt beside her, placing a firm hand on the mare's flank, feeling her tremble beneath his touch. Her eyes, wide and terrified, seemed almost human in their panic, and Luke could feel the bond between them tighten, a silent plea for help that cut deeper than any fear he'd ever known. Daisy whinnied, a sharp, urgent cry that echoed across the empty plains, and Luke's heart raced. He couldn't let her panic worsen the injury. Every instinct in him screamed caution, but the swelling pulsed, growing more pronounced with every passing second. With a deep, steadying breath, Luke positioned the blade against the taut skin. His mind flashed back to every emergency he had ever faced on the ranch, every decision made in the heat of necessity. There had been nights when frostbite nearly claimed a calf, storms that threatened to sweep away the barn, and rattlesnakes hiding in hay bales, but nothing like this. He glanced at the storm clouds gathering beyond the ridges, knowing that the elements would soon trap them in isolation. There was no help coming. It was him and Daisy, and that was it. He pressed the knife lightly against the swelling. At first, nothing happened. Then, a subtle movement, a ripple, almost like the skin was crawling. Luke froze, breath catching in his throat. His eyes widened, heart hammering. Something alive was under that swelling, something moving. He could feel it pulse and twist beneath his palm, slick and unrelenting. His stomach turned, bile rising, but he clenched his teeth and forced himself to stay. Daisy's whinnies turned into soft groans of pain, and Luke's resolve hardened. "Hang on, girl, I won't let it take you," he whispered, voice trembling but firm. The split of the skin was small at first, careful, just enough to see. And then it happened. From beneath the swelling, a cluster of tiny, writhing shapes emerged. Glistening wetly in the lantern light, Luke staggered back, nearly dropping the knife. Parasites, dozens of them, slithered and wriggled, their tiny bodies slick and unnatural, almost glowing under the dim light. He gagged, horror twisting his stomach into knots. He'd seen ticks, he'd seen worms in livestock, but never anything like this. Their sheer number and size were unnatural. He realized then that Daisy had been bitten or infected by something out by the creek, or something far worse, something no one should ever encounter in the wilds of Montana. Luke's mind raced as he fought down the revulsion that threatened to overwhelm him. There was no time to hesitate. Every second the parasites remained, Daisy's leg would worsen, the swelling grow, and the infection could spread. He pulled on his leather gloves, feeling the cold bite into his fingers but giving him the protection he desperately needed. One by one, he began to remove them, each motion precise despite the horror gripping him. The creatures writhed, trying to escape, and Luke's pulse surged. He cursed under his breath, a stream of obscenities sharp enough to cut through the storm wind. Daisy shuddered violently with every movement, but slowly, ever so slowly, the swelling began to recede. Luke's hands were slick with blood and the creatures' slick bodies, his breath ragged from fear and exertion. The barn smelled of iron, hay, and the sharp tang of whiskey, a pungent reminder of how desperate the night had become. Outside, the storm began to gather force, wind rattling the old barn boards as if urging him to finish. Luke's muscles ached, but he pressed on, drawing on the grit and stubbornness that had kept him alive through countless winters, droughts, and cattle drives. Hours seemed to pass in a blur of motion and terror. Luke worked steadily, methodically, removing each parasite with a trembling hand, careful not to harm Daisy further. The mare's eyes softened gradually, panic easing as she sensed relief. Her labored breathing slowed, her trembling diminished, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, Luke leaned back, wiping the sweat and grime from his brow. He looked down at the pile of wriggling, lifeless creatures he had extracted. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to meet Daisy's gaze, relief washing over him in a tidal wave of exhaustion. Yet even as the swelling subsided and Daisy stood shakily on her legs, Luke's heart refused to calm. There was a reason these creatures had thrived, a reason they had targeted Daisy. And as he glanced toward the darkened hills beyond the barn, he felt a chill colder than the winter wind. Something unnatural was out there, waiting. And if these parasites were just the beginning, Luke knew that the stormy night ahead might be the least of their worries. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the Montana plains dusted with fresh snow and glinting under the weak morning sun. The air was crisp, almost painfully clean after the chaos of the previous night, but Luke Harlan felt no relief. He slumped against the barn door, exhausted, muscles aching, hands slick with blood and the residue of the night's horrors. His heart was still hammering, his chest tight from adrenaline and sleepless tension. Yet through all of it, one thing gave him solace: Daisy was alive. The mare stood shakily nearby, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, her coat matted with sweat, snow, and bits of straw. Her eyes, once wide with terror, now regarded Luke with a calmness that only deep trust could bring. She nudged him gently with her nose, a silent expression of gratitude and relief. Luke managed a tired smile, stroking her neck softly. "You made it, girl, you really made it," he whispered, though his voice still trembled from exhaustion and lingering fear. But even as he savored this small victory, Luke's mind could not rest. He had seen the creatures, the parasites, wriggling and pulsing beneath Daisy's swollen leg. He had fought to remove them one by one, saving her from a fate he didn't even want to imagine. And yet, the image of their slick, unnatural bodies haunted him, refusing to fade. What kind of parasite grew so fast, and why had it targeted Daisy? There was something wrong out there in those hills, something unnatural that had crept into his life under the cover of night. He stood slowly, wincing as his legs protested the movement. The barn was quiet now, the storm's fury replaced by the soft whisper of wind across the plains. Luke glanced down at the pile of dead parasites in the corner, their tiny, glistening forms bathed in the pale sunlight. It was a grotesque reminder of what had nearly destroyed Daisy, and almost destroyed him, too. He shook his head, trying to banish the images, but deep down, he knew it wasn't over. Nature had always been unforgiving in these parts, but this was different. Something darker had made its way onto his land. Daisy shifted her weight, flinching slightly, and Luke moved closer, brushing the snow from her coat. "You'll be fine," he murmured, though the words rang hollow. He knew it would take time for her to recover fully, and the psychological toll of the night would linger in both their minds. But as he looked out across the empty plains, scanning the horizon, a sense of unease settled over him. The wind carried with it more than the cold, it carried a warning. Something was still out there. Something that had spawned these creatures, something that had survived the storm and his desperate intervention. Luke turned back to the barn, only to freeze. A subtle movement in the straw caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the low winter sun. But then he saw it, a tiny twitch, subtle but unmistakable. One of the parasites, the smallest one, was still alive. Its body pulsed faintly, swelling slightly with each beat, as if mocking his efforts from the night before. Luke's stomach lurched, a cold dread washing over him. The rancher's instincts took over. He moved quickly, lifting his boot and bringing it down with deliberate force. The parasite was crushed, flattened into a motionless heap, but the act did little to calm his nerves. Luke bent down, scanning the barn floor with a sharp, wary eye. There was no sign of any others, but he knew better than to assume he was done. Whatever had brought them here had survived the harshest winter night, and it could return. He had fought off a threat no man in the county had ever seen, but the plains were vast, and whatever lurked beyond the barn could strike again. Daisy nuzzled him again, softer this time, her trust unbroken despite the horror she had endured. Luke felt a pang of gratitude mixed with anxiety. He had saved her life, but the world beyond his fence line was no longer a safe place. The storm had passed, the sun was rising, and the plains stretched endlessly before him, but Luke Harlan knew that this was only the beginning. Nature had always tested the hardiest of men and animals alike, but sometimes, its tests were more sinister than any storm or predator. He sighed, brushing his hands over his face, letting the tension of the night slowly seep from his body. The ranch needed attention, the herd needed care, and Daisy needed rest. But as he stepped outside, boots crunching over the frost-covered ground, Luke's gaze drifted toward the distant hills. The snow shimmered, concealing secrets he couldn't yet see, and the wind whispered through the pines as if carrying a message. He tightened his coat, hands instinctively reaching for his knife, a silent promise to face whatever came next. The plains were calm, but Luke knew better. Darkness had brushed his life in the form of those creatures, and the memory of their pulsing bodies would never leave him. Yet, despite the fear, there was a stubborn ember of determination in his chest. He had survived the night. Daisy had survived. And whatever darkness lingered beyond the barn, Luke Harlan would face it, come what may. The sun climbed higher, casting light on the endless horizon, but Luke understood this: some shadows never truly disappear.